bombshell. New poll from Rasmussen shows Robert F. Kennedy Jr. neck and neck with President Biden in a survey of the general electorate. Amongst likely Democratic primary voters, Biden still leads Kennedy 62-19. Meanwhile, Axios reports that members of a recent 11-person focus group of swing voters in Georgia want Biden to prove his mental fitness by debating his primary challengers. Now, in a recent interview with Russell Brand, RFK Jr. said Democratic superdelegates will go for Biden at the party convention. Let's listen.
You know, the way that the setup of the Democratic Party at the convention, the way the nomination happens, the super delegates are very, very influential, and he'll get 100% of those. So I think he's confident at this point, or his handlers are confident, that he can win the nomination without debating me, and that the debate can do nothing except for put him in jeopardy. So I assume that's it, although I'm not really I can't really look into his head.
All right, Liz, how much do people read into this Rasmussen polls, that poll that has RFK Jr. only 1 point behind Biden? Some folks have said we shouldn't read into it too closely because it's a survey of the general electorate. And of course, Republican voters won't be able to vote in many states in the Democratic primary. What do you think?
I mean, there's that, but it's also too early for this type of polling to actually really matter. People need to take all of these really, really early polls with a ginormous grain of salt. The fact of the matter is RFK Jr. is kind of a wackadoodle nutjob conspiracy theorist. And on one hand, we see lots and lots of enthusiasm about former President Donald Trump. And so that's not necessarily disqualifying, apparently. And there's certainly a lot of people who are super angry about COVID lockdowns and vaccine mandates, and RFK Jr. is the candidate who's sort of seeking to capitalize on this. But fundamentally, people are turned off by this sort of nut jobbery, and I think it's really too early to over extrapolate from these findings. What do you think?
Well, even outside of this particular poll, RFK Jr. has poll numbers, even among Democratic voters, that people in the Republican primary field, I think, would, sell a limb for. I mean, he's at 20% even in other more reputable or more close to tracking the Democratic electorate style polls. And despite that significant showing, especially at this early date in the primary process, a lot of people are saying that is exactly why he should have an opportunity to debate Joe Biden the way that other more establishment candidates have been given that opportunity in the past. And substantively, while I think what you're saying about some of his the things that he said about the purported link between vaccines and autism, which as of yet has not been proven, and some of the COVID skepticism, which he has been validated about. There's other aspects of his appeal that I think are really getting undersold, including the extent to which he's carved out a space for himself as one of the more anti-war candidates on the left and on the right. He's also someone who has this long history of being an environmental advocate, an environmental lawyer, in a way that presents some interesting contrast with Joe Biden, who many Democrats are frustrated with for backtracking and betraying some of his commitments to the climate movement. So do you not see any way in which all of those other benefits might look very attractive to an electorate who might be willing to look the other way with respect to some of the vaccine stuff?
Well, with what you were saying about how the link between vaccines and autism has, as of yet, not been proven, in your own words. I mean, look, we did this in the 90s with the whole Andrew Wakefield vaccines cause autism's moral panic moment, or maybe not moral panic, but panic moment. This is something that has been, the province of some small corner of the American electorate time and time again. We've been re-upping these types of claims for decades now, and they've never held water. They've never been proven to be true. And so the fact that RFK Jr. is so into that and has made that such a talking point really gives me a lot of pause. I mean, you look at some of his anti-corporate statements, and it's not just that he's sort of this anti-corporatist, skeptic of big business looking to regulate corporations to a greater degree. It's that he wants to throw many of those people in jail. He calls people treasonous. He has advocated, perhaps off the cuff, but it's still very Trumpy in rhetoric, for locking up the Koch brothers or executing them. I mean, my God. this is just a pretty delusional and unhinged guy. And I look at the performance of Tulsi Gabbard, an anti-war candidate, as evidence that, despite the fact that I absolutely love his anti-war positions, and I think we need more anti-war candidates, I mean, Tulsi was kind of that, and she didn't really, do very much except get, a long-term Tucker Carlson show speaking spot.
Well, I think the example of adopting an anti-war framing and coasting on that successfully to the White House is, in fact, Donald Trump. You can say what you want about Donald Trump, but rhetorically, he put a lot of distance between himself and the Republican establishment when he was running in 2016, and was able to basically pull the whole Republican Party establishment away from the blob consensus in a way that has had lasting side effects, in which I think a lot of the other more mainstream Republican candidates are still trying to reckon with. So I think I disagree. I do believe that for many voters, whether it's his drain the swamp anti-corruption rhetoric, whether it's his anti-war rhetoric, whether it's his CDC COVID accountability rhetoric, there's a lot of appeal there. And it's worth noting also that while the liberal media and a lot of the establishment media is really emphasizing RFK Jr.'s history of talking about vaccines and autism and the like, that is not in fact what he is running on. And if the feedback that Donald Trump got from the CNN town hall is any indication, it can be the case that repeated questions about something that the candidate themselves aren't trying to center can backlash against the person who keeps bringing that up more than there's backlash against the candidate. So in the Trump town hall, the commentator kept asking Trump about 1-6, kept asking Trump about a number of issues that maybe you don't like Trump's answers on. But when folks were asked, potential Trump voters were asked after the town hall whether that reflected negatively on Donald Trump, they said no. They thought that the questioner was bullying him into talking about subjects that were in the past when Trump wanted to focus on issues that were germane to the interests of working people. And I think a lot of folks looking at RFK right now are saying, okay, I don't care about the autism stuff. He's not talking about the autism stuff. He's trying to talk about the war in Ukraine and these big substantive issues, and everyone's trying to drag him back in the past. And those folks come off as bad faith actors.
I wouldn't really say they're very far in the past. This is stuff that he is actively talking about. And I mean, you know me, Bree. Like, look, I am as interested in holding the CDC accountable for COVID failings. I think there needs to be a much larger reckoning on the topic of school closures. And I've actually, at Reason, been writing about Randy Weingarten, the teachers union head honcho's sort of rehabilitation tour and an attempt to retcon the record on school closures and act like, oh no, everybody was all working together to get kids back in school during the pandemic. And that's not what was happening. We had teachers unions and very powerful political players who were keeping kids out of school far longer than they needed to in a way that was out of step with the global consensus, out of step with much of Western Europe. So I am more than perhaps most people in favor of holding the CDC accountable and doing a very clear rehashing of pandemic era failures. But RFK Jr. isn't the type of person to reform those agencies and actually make them prepared for, God forbid, the next pandemic, or to fire the people who were responsible for awful public policy decisions that harmed people like you and me and children all across the country and working people. And I mean, everybody suffered some of the toll of the pandemic. And it's time to fire the people who made some of those decisions. But I don't actually believe that RFK Jr. is the person to do do that. So I am as sympathetic as they come on that. Because
it's because the alternative is Joe Biden.
Because he's a conspiratorial psycho dude who, in fact, isn't just interested in ensuring that political actors get punished in accordance with the law, but has much more sensationalist, almost like Duterte-esque rhetoric about what we ought to do with political opponents or political disfavors. It's actually kind of disturbing if you go back through his record, the degree to which he admires figures like Hugo Chavez and the sort of jailing of political opponents and all these things. You actually go through what he said, and he's kind of the Trump of the left. And I'm not really keen on Trump, and so I'm not really keen on RFK Jr. either.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly the issue, that a lot of folks are keen on Trump, and they're keen on the kind of rhetoric that says it's going to hold political bad actors, people who have stolen money through political corruption, people who have done insider trading, people who cost the American public a lot more than your average criminal at CVS, getting away with it because they happen to be in Congress. And having leaders who are willing to actually be critical of the establishment and say that there should be, yes, sometimes criminal penalties for people having criminal actions, even if they're elites, is exactly what the electorate is looking for. I did want to ask you this one last point about the
hold on.
the superdelegates.
That's not what he's saying, though, right? Like, he's not saying that they ought to be punished in accordance extrajudicially, extra legally punished. And I see him as this sort of like extreme expander of the carceral state, attempting to use the law not just to punish people who have done authentic wrongdoing, but also to attempt to punish political opponents of his.
I gotta say, I've listened to a number of his speeches since he announced. I haven't seen any of those statements. I don't want to contradict you. I just want to put out there that I haven't seen anything that corroborates what you're saying, but it's worth definitely checking in and following up on.
I direct you to Matt Welch's work at Reason Magazine. He has gone through the archive of RFK Jr. Hobby horses and statements in the past, and he has excavated some really fascinating stuff.
So you're not saying that these are things that he said in the context of his presidential run?
No, I think he's absolutely trying to sort of like put on a little bit of a more socially acceptable veneer now. I mean, we're also when did he announce? Like a few months ago, a few weeks ago?
Not even, a few weeks ago.
Okay, so we're pretty fresh here, but part of the job of political journalists and commentators is to not just look at the way that they're doing their PR campaign now and the things that they're saying now, but to look at what they've said over the course of a long career in politics.
Sure,
and
I also think that a lot of voters are going to appreciate, you know, when you are making the kind of rhetorical statements that you make in the context of a casual everyday life. I might sit here over a dinner table and say, yes, we got to bring the bad guys down, lock them up, lock her up. That's the kind of rhetoric that is very common in informal settings. And I think a lot of folks are going to be judging how he frames his presidential run very differently. Although I think you're perfectly right. It's fair to pull those comments up and let people judge for themselves. All right, we'll continue to follow this story for sure. More Rising right after this.